Wow, what a great crowd. Thank you for being here. Thank you all out there for being here. Welcome to Tertulia Histórica, a lunchtime history lecture series sponsored by the Office of the State Historian here in Santa Fe. Bienvenidos, welcome. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Good morning and good afternoon. I, Rob Martinez, State Historian, am your presenter today. And I'm going to talk to you today about CASTA, Race and Identity in Colonial New Mexico. This is one of my favorite topics because I do a lot of historical research, but I also do genealogy, family history, and I always say to people who want to do their genealogy and family history, or study history in general, you have to be brave to do it, because you're going to find out things that maybe you didn't want to find out, or that will surprise you, make you happy, make you sad, shock you a little bit. But that's what family history should do. That's what all history should do, actually. But today we're going to talk about CASTA. So, next slide. All right, let's look at this quote. This is by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a poet, philosopher. She was a nun in colonial Mexico, in Nueva España in the 1600s. Not to be born of an honorable father would be a blemish I must own. If receiving my being from no other, I had not known it was his alone. Far more generous was your mother when she arranged your ancestry, offering many a likely father among whom to choose your pedigree. She was born out of wedlock. That means that for a while she didn't know who her father was. Her mom had an affair, a relationship with the man, then was with child and gave birth, and then wonderful Sor Juana was born. But she's talking about this idea of how we choose and pick our ancestry, our origins, partly to explain to ourselves who we are, but also to explain to everyone else who we are, or who we want people to think we are. Next slide. This is a slide by a quote, by a New Mexican, Pedro Bautista Pinon, in 1812. He was a representative for New Mexico to the Spanish Cortes. He went to Cadiz, Spain, to see the king, to report on this tiny little province and kingdom of New Mexico. And I always liked this quote. It caught my eye. In New Mexico, there are no castas of African origin, caste. There are no people of African origin, according to Pedro Pinon. My province is probably the only one with this prerogative in all of Spanish America. At no time has any casta of people of African origin been known there. Well, he didn't know his history, and we can forgive him. There was no DNA back then. Spaniards and pure Indians, listen to this, that are hardly distinguishable from ourselves are the ones who make up the total of 40,000 inhabitants. Well, let's see, 1812, let's see what was going on 100 years before that, 200 years before that. Next slide. Just so we have our history, our periods in our minds, so we know how history is unfolded in this part of the world. There are obviously Native American people here for hundreds, thousands of years before any Europeans got here. But in 1519 is when Hernán Cortés enters what's now Mexico and conquers the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. This starts the era of the conquistador in what's now Mexico. It was named Nueva España, New Spain. And these conquistadors, they became very powerful, very wealthy on gold and silver, taxing the people they conquered. It's in 1535 that the crown in Spain says, enough of that. I'm going to send a viceroy, a virrey, a vice king, Antonio de Mendoza, also a bishop, Juan de Zumárraga. The Catholic Church has a major presence starting in this period, and the Spanish crown. After exploration into New Mexico, we're colonized in 1598. Juan de Oñate brings those Spanish colonists. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And this is our colonial period here in New Mexico, 1598 to 1821. Then our Mexican period is 1821 to 1848. And then there's a little war between the US and Mexico, which results in us becoming a territory, 1850 to 1912. And finally, statehood in 1912. And in the future, who knows? Next. Just so we can see a map, because I like to have a visual of a map, to see how we're connected to all points south during this colonial period I'll be talking about. This is the Camino Real, the Royal Road. It was a trail, a dusty trail, but I like the name, the Royal Road. And this shows how there was movement north and south starting in the 1590s on a regular basis after Juan de Oñate establishes a colony. And it goes up and down north-south from Mexico City in the south, all through the mining towns of Zacatecas, San Luis Potosí, Aguascalientes, up into Durango, which is where the Catholic Church will have its base and New Mexico will be ruled from, all the way down there. And then the road moves up through Parral, into Chihuahua, Guadalupe del Paso del Norte, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and all the pueblos in this area, okay? Now, please keep in mind, this wasn't the only road. Maps like this make it look like and give the impression that we're the only ones who mattered. Well, there were roads that extended from Mexico City up into this mining area and then extended over towards the Pacific Ocean into Sonora and that area, then over to the east along the Gulf of Mexico, all the way into Texas, okay? So these roads were the lifeblood of empire, okay? They carried humans of all kinds. They carried animals, foods, ideas, official ideas, religion, Catholicism, government, the viceroy, the king, governors, colonists, settlers, and diseases. We know from records during the colonial period into the Mexican period, territorial period, there were pandemics every 20, 25 years. People were dying. We know from church records and civil documents, it was a part of life. This thing we went through a few years ago isn't our first rodeo, okay? So I want you to keep this in mind. It took anywhere from 10 to 12 months to do this journey, so you couldn't just get on an airplane or a train and make that trip. It took a lot of planning. Next. So let's talk about Mexico, Nueva España in the 1500s. At first, when the Spaniards conquered the Aztecs and all the other native peoples, the Tlaxcalans and the Cholulans, the idea was to have a República Española, a Spanish republic, and a República India, the Native Americans. That was it. You'd have them separate. And of course, the rulers would be the Spanish. This wasn't going to be a democratic egalitarian system. Few Spanish lived in New Spain in the 1500s compared to Native Americans. They were the minority, but they were the ruling class, the Spanish. But human nature being what it is, Spaniards started to mix with Native American people. Sometimes it was love, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was gentle, sometimes it was violent. It was very human. And initially, the babies, the offspring of a Spaniard and a Native American and Indian, was considered Español, Spanish, even if they were half native. At first, it wasn't a big deal, but then things start to change as the population of mixed blood people ballooned and started to really overcome the Spanish, which wasn't too hard to do. There weren't that many. but other native peoples. When we get into the 1600s, we start to see things change as Africans come to New Spain, Nueva España, both as slaves and free people. They're colonists too. They're soldiers, they're settlers, they're merchants, they're glassblowers, they're blacksmiths. They do all kinds of things. They're part of the story as well. The Spanish at first made striking contrasts between native Indians, blacks, Spanish and Indians, and blacks and Spanish. But things start to get complicated as interracial mixing takes place. What do you do about these people who do not fit in these black and white categories? Pun intended. They didn't know what to do with this. So by the 1700s in Mexico, New Spain, Spanish colonial society was racially and ethnically complex. And I'll even add culturally, because you have all kinds of different aspects of culture, foods, language, art, music. All these things start to combine and blend. This is also the age of enlightenment, the scientific revolution, when scientists, people, priests, governors, officials start to categorize animals, plants. But how about people? People start to be classified as well. And this society is race obsessed. So, CASTA. What is CASTA? In Spanish, we say CASTA. In English, caste. Somebody mentioned a book that came out recently called Caste. It's a different story, but it's similar. It's the same idea. The CASTA system in Spain's world empire was a system of dividing society into racial and ethnic categories. It was a way of trying to control the people, trying to control what was happening, trying to control the uncontrollable, this mixing of people and cultures. This casta system could be very strict in the big cities like Puebla, Mexico City, Guadalajara, Zacatecas. But once you get to outlying frontiers like New Mexico, it's a very fluid system that can be manipulated and used to your advantage and disadvantage. In India, they have a caste system. That's a very strict system. You are born into that system and you die in whatever, like the untouchables are at the bottom, the priestly class at the top. But this system was a little bit more fluid the further away from the big cities you got. I want to talk about this word because it shows up in some documents in union with caste, casta. It's calidad, quality or status. When you see that put with a caste or casta designation, it's implying something more than merely bloodlines or appearance. Obviously, it might have to do with your skin color, whether you're light-skinned or dark-skinned, your occupation, whether it was a high-level job or a low-level job, how much wealth you had or didn't have, your purity of blood. I'll talk a little bit about that, the idea that you have the right kind of blood and not the wrong kind of bloodlines or ancestry. Questions of honor, integrity, place of origin, how you spoke Spanish, what kind of a Catholic you were. By the way, I'm Catholic. My dad's mom, very devout Catholics. My dad's people, not so much. So it depends on the family and how they act. And this gives you legitimacy or illegitimacy. I'm not talking about being born out of wedlock. I'm talking about your place in society, how significant you were compared to insignificant. Calidad was not determined only by skin color, but all of these social and moral attributes. So where we see a lot of this casta system are in church records. That's where one of the places where they really start to apply the casta system. There's a lot of ambiguity, there's confusion sometimes, and sometimes depending on the priest, there's indifference. Mestizo means half Spanish and half Native American. This designation can be very inconsistent, and they had books for each designation. Sometimes there's a casta book and a book for Españoles, Spanish people, and then sometimes a book for Indios, native people, Indians. By the 1800s, the crown insists that the priest must be very strict in applying this in baptismal records or marriage records. In one case, the bishop told priests that they should register that they administered the sacrament. I baptized this baby, I married this couple, but the rest wasn't that important. Whatever they're told about casta or their perception is kind of arbitrary. And how it was applied was arbitrary. It might be a couple coming in to get married or baptize a baby saying, we're Espanol, we're Spanish. It might be the people in the community saying, they're mestizos, they're mixed. It might be the priest saying, I'm just going to look at you and decide for myself what you are, depending on my own perceptions and perspective. When I was doing research at the Archivo General de la Nación, the National Archives in Mexico City one time, I've been there many times doing research, I was working for Stan Hordy's looking for crypto Jews, conversos, judaizantes, people accused of being Jewish while they're Catholic. They're outwardly Catholic, baptized Catholic, but secretly practicing Judaism. This catalog, I can't remember, it was probably 100 or 200 pages long. This is the front page, Memoria de los San Benitos que pusieron en la Iglesia Catedral de esta Ciudad de México en el año 1667. This is a record of San Benitos. That's what you had to wear when you were accused by the Inquisition. And it would have symbols or letters that would tell everybody what your crime was. And whatever the outcome, if you survived your Inquisition trial, they would hang it in the church so everybody could see it. It had your name on it. So they'd remind you and everyone else what you had done. Anyway, I put this in my presentation because if you go to the next slide, just to give you an example, there's the first page starting in 1528. It's about 150 years worth. And they entered the person's name and what their job was. The first one says Hernando Alonso Herrero. He worked with metal, with iron. He's from Niebla. He's a resident of Mexico. That meant Mexico City. Hereje judaizante, heresy of being a secret Jew. This document is shows people accused of judaizante, also Luterano, if you're a Protestant. They just had a catch-all term, Lutheran. That's it. And you were a heretic and could be brought before the Inquisition. Limpieza de sangre came from Spain, this idea that technically they would not allow anybody to come from Spain to the Americas unless they were old Christians, old Catholics. If you had a Jewish grandparent, you couldn't come. If you had a Muslim grandmother, you couldn't come. And the idea was that this limpieza, this cleanliness, this purity of blood somehow kept the Catholic faith pure and it kept the population pure. But the fact is, people were selling fake genealogies all the time. And people snuck on ships. People would just say, yeah, we're old Christians, don't ask too many questions, because they needed immigrants to come populate the areas that were conquered. So as we know, there were people coming here with these backgrounds, but this, for our talk about casas, tratos notables con el demonio, this means people who trafficked or entered into a pact with the devil. This would mean witchcraft, brujeria. This would mean sorcery, hechiceria, a pact with the devil. And these people could be from Spain, from Mexico, sometimes from France, sometimes from England. There were Africans on this list, mulattos, meaning people of part Spanish, part Black background. There's mestizos. Typically, the people accused of witchcraft were of mixed background, mixed blood, or Black or Native American. Next. Calidad versus status. Calidad de casta. This is the quality of your caste. It was often secondary to one's station in life. What often mattered was wealth as opposed to poverty, your occupation, how one dressed, how one carried themselves. Skin color really mattered, but could be secondary if you had money and you had a good job. Real quick, I want to mention that in the colonial society, we'll see later on, you had to dress a certain way according to your casta designation. And if you were caught dressing above, you can get into real trouble. So the casta system in colonial Mexico and by extension, New Mexico. Look at this list. It's just one that I found. There are many lists. This casta list could have up to 18 or 19 different combinations. Think about that. What a priest or a government official had to have in his mind to designate what a person was. At the top, we see the word Español. Español is Spanish, but this is where we get into confusion doing family history in New Mexico or Mexico. You look at that, you go, oh, my ancestors are Spanish. They're Spaniards. They're from Spain. No, that's a casta designation. It just means you are considered at the top of this system. You might be light-skinned, you might know the governor really well, you might have a good job, you might own land, but an Español in this system could very well have, and probably usually does have, some Native American ancestry. All right? Now, here it says, de Español e India, with a Spaniard and a native woman, you get a mestizo. Then from an Español and a mestizo, you get a castizo. A castizo is 75% Spanish, 25% Native American. And when a castizo and an Español have a kid, voila, a Spanish kid. That's how you become Spanish, but have Native American. And then you go down, there's mestizo, there's mestizo, coyote. You hear that a lot in New Mexico. That means a wolf. The lower you get, they're insulting. A coyote is a wolf. It's true. There's a mulatto, the black, and an español, negro, española, mulatto. And then morisco, that goes back, that's a throwback to Spain for a Moor, a Muslim, a morisco. But here it doesn't mean Moorish or Muslim. It means part black and part Spanish. Then you have lobo down there. That's a wolf. Coyote, coyote. So it goes on down and down. In New Mexico, it's not that complicated. You probably see just a few of these designations in New Mexico, but in Mexico City, in the books, you see a lot of them. And at the bottom, sometimes the priest would they'd look at the baby and they'd just put, está en el viento. It's up in the air. I don't even know. The baby's so mixed, I can't even tell you what the baby is. So I hope you're getting the idea of how this system was, at least from the Spanish perspective, ideally put in place to try to control the society and the mixing of peoples. Next slide. Now, in New Mexico, we get our own special designation, which I've seen applied in other areas of Mexico. But here you get genizados in the 1700s. This was a term used in the early 1700s by Diego de Vargas, the reconqueror of New Mexico in the 1690s. He uses it to describe some Native Americans, and it means janissary or auxiliary. It comes from the Ottoman Turks. They would take little Christian boys, toughen them up, and then throw them in the front lines to go to war. Well, these Native Americans were children of war. They were cautivos, captives in the 1700s. In New Spain, the term Ladino was used to describe these Hispanicized native peoples. In Spain, Ladino is the language, the old Spanish of the Sephardic Jews. But in the Americas, it just means a Native American who's very Hispanicized, who speaks really good Spanish. Next. So who were these genizados in New Mexico? Non-Pueblo native peoples who were captives, captured by other nomadic native groups. Everyone was warring here in the 1700s. Very dangerous place to be. But Spanish people, Hispanic, Latino, whatever we call it, they didn't use those terms back then. But they were part of this system. all these people would raid each other's communities, kill men, take women and children, and then turn them into servants and slaves. Children of war, soldiers, warriors. In the New Mexico system, these little natives would be catechized, baptized, given Christian names, but they were marginalized. They were marginalized because they no longer belonged to the tribe they came from, but they really weren't Hispanic, they weren't Puebloan, and so they were seen as other. They were kind of to be feared. They were the lowest of the low, and they were settlers, ranchers, farmers. They're also explorers. They go on some of the expeditions in the 1760s and 1770s with Spaniards into the Great Basin and other parts of the West, this part where we live in. The first attempt for Genízaros to have a community was at Sandia Pueblo in 1733. They were turned down, but it's a great document because it shows these native people who are part of the Spanish system, but it lists their names and their tribe of origin, their community of origin. In the 1750 census, Genízaros are shown to be in Taos, in Rio Arriba and Belén, and then by the 1755 or so, the governor at the time starts to establish communities on the periphery of New Mexico to be a buffer between the Spanish and Puebloan people in the middle and the Navajo, the Diné, the Apache, the Comanche, the Hopi, all these people coming into New Mexico. And they established communities. They were part of the Las Trampas grant, Truchas, San Miguel Elvado, Abiquiu, and Belén. Abiquiu, I love this old photo. It's probably from the 1890s. It shows the old Pueblo, and there's the old church right there. Abiquiu is one of the major places where people go to learn about Genízaros. Next, yeah, sorry. Abiquiu was originally a Hispano settlement in the late 1740s, but it was abandoned in 1747 because it was so dangerous to live there. There were a lot of raids from nomadic groups, and it's resettled by the governor at the time, Tomás Vélez Cachupin, with Genízaros. But there's always Hispanic people, Hispanos living in the area. So there's that combining, that interaction right there, down the bluff from Abiquiu, there was Santa Rosa de Lima. Somebody just mentioned they have Apache. This is how it happens. Look at this marriage record. This is from my own family genealogy. This is a marriage record at Sandia Pueblo on the 12th of December in 1782. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. These are records. There's a formula to them, gives the date. The priest usually says he's marrying them according to the Holy Council of Trent. But if you look at the margin, it gives the name Josef Antonio Jaramillo. He's designated as Español, ESP with a little L, con Juana, Ju with a little A, Montoya, and under that it says Mestiza. So there's the mixing going on. Part Spanish, part Native American. We're deep into the 1700s. Next. Now, this is from the area of Cochiti Pueblo. I love this record because Cochiti Pueblo is still there. There used to be a Hispanic community there, a Spanish community called La Cañada de Cochiti. It's not there anymore. But we have records from there. And this is one of my ancestors. This was in San Buenaventura de Cochiti. It says at the top, it's from the March of 1777. This is one of my ancestors, Julian Ramon. Look, it says mulato, vecino. He's a resident, a vecino, but he's also part black. But then when you look into the document, it talks about his parents. It says a son from a legitimate marriage of Alonso Salas y Juana María Páez, vecinos de la Cañada, de calidad mulatos. It says the calidad mulatos. Let me see if I can see it right here. Right there, calidad mulatos. right there, we don't really know if he's part African or if they are. What he's doing is he's looking down on them, saying they are of a mulatto quality. Not good. Interesting, this guy. I researched the priest. His name is down there, Stanislao Mariano de Marulanda. He came from a high-level part of Mexico, New Spain, very high level. He, like a lot of the priests that came to New Mexico, looked down on the people here. They may well have been part African or part Native American, dark skinned, maybe burnt by the sun, maybe just kind of rowdy people, not very classy. Okay. And so he wrote them down as the calidad of a mulatto quality. Interestingly enough, he does that for just a few entries. And then I found out doing some research, a 1776 report, it says that he was going blind. So he may not have even known what he was saying. Alonso Salas was the father in that document. Here's his burial record. I have it underlined, his name, Alonso Salas. Then over there it says Español. There you go. All of a sudden, he becomes Spanish. He goes from being the calidad mulatto to being Spanish. And it lists his wife there, who he had been married to. Now, that little baby that was baptized, who was described as mulatto, here he is getting married at Cochiti, I don't know, 25 years later. He's getting married, and there's his name underlined, Julián Ramón Salas, soltero, single, Español. So he's all of a sudden considered Spanish. That's why we have to take these designations in all directions with a grain of salt. Let's look at some paintings, some colorful paintings. These are CASTA paintings. These were commissioned to illustrate the variety of intermixing taking place in the colonies in the Americas in the 1600s and 1700s. Let's see how the crown and how the higher-ups perceived racial mixing in colonial New Spain. This was a way of whitening or watching a person's ancestry or genealogy. I kind of illustrated that already with the CASTA list, but a Spanish and a native would have a mestizo, would have a child with an Española, a Spanish woman, then that person would be castizo, and then all of a sudden they'd become Español, Spanish. So look at this. De negro y de India sale lobo. So from a black man and a Native American woman, you get what they would call a lobo. And obviously, these paintings were not just to illustrate the mixing, they were warnings. Don't mix the races. Don't do that. Obviously, this is kind of a violent, go back. There's some violence taking place there, but we get an idea of what their clothes look like, their foods, and that poor little kid is caught in the middle, which happens with families, right? Next. But look here, with a Spanish person and a black woman, you get a mulatto, but this is calmer because there's a Spanish person involved. And I don't know what he's doing there. It looks like he's lighting something or maybe feeding him something, but it's a calm child and a much more calm family. But look at how different their dresses. You had to dress a certain way depending on your caste designation. Next. There's another one showing Espanol, Spanish with a black woman. This is a worse image. They're fighting. She's really letting him have it. I don't know what he did, but it wasn't good. And that poor child is trying to stop mom from clubbing dad with something. And again, it shows the food. It looks like there's some sugar cane there, maybe, dishes, and how they dress very differently from one another. From a Spaniard, Español, and mulata, you get a morisca. And so this is a more peaceful painting with a Spanish person, mulata, and a little mixed blood child. Here's another morisca, but this one's a little bit different. You could see she's not happy. She's got her hands on her hips, probably saying, "Where have you been?" You know. And he's saying, "Shh, don't let the neighbors hear." And the children are always protecting mom. I like that. You know, they're always going and saying, "What are you doing, Dad?" But this is another one that gives that example of the different clothing. From an Espanol and India, you get mestizo. Mestizo is a catch-all term anymore. It kind of just means mixed, but it literally means part Spanish and part native. Keep in mind these Espanol designations. The Espanol or Españolas probably have native background in their grandparents or great-grandparents' background. From a mestizo in India, you get a coyote. There's coyote. By the way, people always ask, well, nowadays, coyote means something else. Yes, once we become part of the United States and there's white people coming along the Santa Fe Trail, a person whose one parent is Mexican, New Mexican, and one parent is white American is also called coyote now in these modern times. But back then it meant a mestizo, the child of a mestizo and a native person. From an Espanol and mestiza, you see a castiza, that means mostly Spanish. Good. From a castizo and Española, you get Spanish person. So you could see how fluid and all the different movement you get from the casta paintings. Look at all those paintings to try to explain what the society was like in colonial times in Mexico. In New Mexico, again, it wasn't quite this complex, not this complicated. So these images are static. They tell us something about racial blending, that it was happening, that's for sure. It gives us ideas about cultural attributes. They tell us some things, but they can't tell us everything. There's a book out there. The author's name is Cope. It's a collection of wills, testamentos from CASTA. So it gives you an idea that they weren't always low on the society. Some of them were, as I mentioned earlier, merchants, glass blowers, blacksmiths, and they had extensive wills with listing their goods, their property. It's quite amazing. But again, some of these are warnings about mixing the races. Next slide. So let's talk about Pedro Pino's claim that there were no people of African background in New Mexico. And of course, we know that African history in New Mexico starts in 1539 with Esteban the Moor. He was African. He's the first official representative to the Pueblo people at Zuni. They kill him. However, in 1539, he is the guy. In 1598, with the Oñate expedition, there's a man named Alvaro Garcia Holgado who is described as mulatto. He's a soldier with the expedition. There's also Cristobal López de Áviles from Oviedo, Spain, who's described as mulatto. So we knew that even in Spain, people weren't just running around being European. There were people of African background there. He was described as swarthy and black-bearded, dark-skinned with the black beard. Well, common ancestor to all of us came in 1598, Bartolomé Romero from Corral de Almaguer. He's also described as dark and black-bearded. Maybe he's mulatto, we don't know. Now, when we were doing research there in 1599, we went to Corral de Almaguer and we found his baptismal record, and it didn't say anything about any racial mixing or mulatto or anything, but you never know. Next slide. Black slaves were part of the 1598 expedition, and some escaped. They got away from the expedition. Diego de Vargas in the 1690s, he brought an African drummer and town crier from Congo named Sebastián de Rodriguez. He plays a major part in the Reconquest, and he settles in New Mexico. In fact, his grandchildren were some of the settlers with Genízaros and other mixed blood people at Las Trampas. Next slide. Let's see what some priests and other officials had to say about us New Mexicans in the colonial period. Fray Esteban de Perea in 1631, he said, inhabitants of New Mexico are made up of so many mestizos, mulattoes, and others who are worse. Wow, those are my people. So dangerous and of little moral strength. He was sometimes embarrassed by the people of New Mexico and felt that the local Native American influence was also bad. He just didn't like it here. And he didn't like any of the people here. Next slide. Fray Alonso de Posada in 1661. New Mexico has no more than 100 vecinos, citizens. These would have been the Español Castizo class. Mulattos, mestizos, and all have Spanish blood, though it is slight. In other words, not a lot. Next. Fray Francisco Atanasio Dominguez, in his amazing report from 1776, he reports on everyone everywhere, but I just took some excerpts here. About the people of Santa Cruz, which is near Española, suffice to say that most of them pass for Spaniards. I used to think, well, they look like Spanish people, but I learned that passing for Spanish was a crime. That means you're trying to be something you're not. About the people of Las Trampas, where I also have roots. For the most part, they are a ragged lot. They are as festive as they are poor and very merry. I'm glad they're happy. They are low class, and there are very few of good or even moderately good blood. Next. Fray Ambrosio Guerra in 1801, about the people of Albuquerque. All our vecinos, residents, most are genizaros, which is a mixture of various nations, meaning there are a lot of native people in Albuquerque at the time. And the rest are mulattos, coyotes, and a few Spanish, although most consider themselves Spanish without it being so. They speak no other language other than poorly understood Castilian. You have to remember that, yes, our ancestors from Spain and New Spain were speaking Spanish, but they were bringing Mexican Indians with them and mestizos, and then came here, and Pueblo people here were speaking Spanish, and the genizaros were speaking Spanish. He describes the genizaro Spanish, Dominguez does, as being kind of twisted and not very good. Well, that mixes in with all of our other Spanish, and these genizaros are in households helping raise kids and teaching them to speak Spanish too. Next slide. Again, passing for Spanish. Look at this. Many pass for Spaniards who in their own hearts know they are mulattoes. 1774. Again, passing as a Spaniard was a serious threat to the maintenance and alignment of the social order, which required constant management and surveillance. Next slide. Moving fast because I have a lot to show you stuff. So was this term Español useless? Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. In some contexts it is, others it isn't. In New Mexico, everyone was just kind of equal here. This was a poor place. You might have more land than your neighbor. You might look a little more Spanish than your neighbor. But here, everyone pretty much dressed the same. Everyone had to work the land. Everyone had to ranch. Everyone had to hunt. It was a poor place. You couldn't really lord it over anybody. In New Mexico, it did not mean you were from Spain or only Spanish ancestry. It meant you were culturally Spanish, more or less. You might look it and you might be ethnically Spanish, but there's definitely mixing going on there. Next slide. New Mexico castas. Hernan Martín Serrano, he came with Juan de Oñate in 1598. He establishes the Martínez family. That's my family. Martínez. Well, look at this. We know from the records he had a wife. He was from Zacatecas in Mexico, mining town. He had a wife named Juana Rodriguez, but we have no idea whether she made it to New Mexico or if they even had kids. But we do know that we descend from his two sons, Hernan and Luis, who in documents are described as mestizos, even indios, and that Hernan was the son of Inés, Ladina, India Ladina, very Hispanicized, very intelligent woman, but she was a Tano Indian. Next. Bartolomé Montoya. He was from Cantiana, Spain, outside of Sevilla. He comes with Oñate's colony in 1600 with reinforcements. His wife was Maria de Zamora, a Mexican Indian. She gets accused of witchcraft. Remember I talked about how the lower classes are the ones accused? She gets accused of trying to help their daughter kill her husband. Point is, she's Mexican Indian. He and she are common ancestors to all of us Nuevo Mexicanos with roots in the colonial period, and all of their children are described as mestizos, half Native American. Juan Griego, he was a Greek. Griego means Greek in Spanish. He came all the way to New Mexico. He brought Pascuala Bernal, his wife, who was also Mexican Indian, and we descend from them as well. They're common ancestors. So they're part Native American, and these are our ancestors. Next. Let's jump now to the Vargas era, the 1690s. I was doing some research into some of those colonists, and this happened when I was looking at the Tafoya family. Tafoya is a very common name in New Mexico, and this Sayago Arroyo family is deep in that family. Well, when they come here, they're described as Espanol, Spanish. Margarita Sayago de Gonzalez was the daughter of Diego Sayago Arroyo from Mexico City and Teresa Dominguez de Mendoza. This couple was of CASTA origin. Next. Simón de Arroyo married Maria de Mora in 1684 in Mexico City. This is a very basic entry, but when you go and look into the marriage records, it shows that he was married to Juana de Zuleta beforehand. This is how you do genealogy. And so I needed to look up their marriage record, and she was a huérfana, it says, of Mexico City, an orphan. So, next page. I found this marriage record for Simón de Arroyo, his first marriage, and it says on the side there in the margin, velados, they were veiled, and then Simón de Arroyo, mulatto. Juana de Zuleta, mulata. So they are of African and Spanish origin. Next page. I won't read the whole thing to you. This is just a transcription and translation of the document. But needless to say, it says in the Spanish, Simón de Arroyo, mulato libre de cautiverio. It means he was a free mulatto. He was not a slave. And it says the same thing about Juana de Zuleta. Next. Afán de Rivera, the Rivera family. This is also a common family in New Mexico. We used to think he was part of the Betanzos family. We weren't sure of his origins. They were very obscure. He came north from what's now Mexico in the 1690s. But digging into the Parral records, which are right here in the state library, I found a document that opened up his world. He was a merchant in New Mexico, but he had ties to Parral. And here in New Mexico, he's called Don Francisco. He was considered Spanish. Don is a term of elevated status. Don Roberto, Don Francisco. Next slide, please. Well, I found his last will and testament at the archives of Hidalgo de Parral. And in the will, Francisco Afán de Rivera identified himself as a native of Mexico City. We didn't know that. He was a resident, vecino of Villanueva de Santa Cruz in New Mexico. We knew that. But we found out that he was the son of Juan de Rivera and Josefa del Castillo. We did not know that. Next slide. So I went and there's a page of, just to give you an idea of what we historians have to deal with when we're reading old documents. This is a page from his will. Next slide. So I went and found the marriage record for his parents in Mexico City. Look at that. They're recorded in the Matrimonios de Castas. They're in the Casta books. So even though he's Espanol in New Mexico, there's the record right there for Juan de Rivera and Josefa del Castillo. He's listed as a Morisco, meaning he's part African, and he's in our ancestry. Next slide. Next slide. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back to that one. That one looked the same to me. Baptism of Francisco Afán de Rivera. There he's recorded in the Bautismos de Españoles. So his parents are Casta, but he's recorded in the Españoles book. There he is on the side. It says Fran with a little CO, Francisco, and that's just his baptismal record. So there you go. Now, thank you. Vigil, very common name. I have this family in my genealogy. Many of us do. Francisco Montes Vigil was a New Mexico colonist of 1695 from Zacatecas. He was a mulatto. He was part African. He was the son of Juan Montes Vigil and an unknown mother, married to Maria Jimenez Anciso. In New Mexico, they're considered Espanol. we know this because we were in Zacatecas. I'm not the only one. A lot of people have gone there and done research, but we found his father's will, and he made two wills. I think he thought he was going to die, made a will out, then he lived, and then he made another will. But it's consistent because he doesn't list that he was married. Juan Montes because he wasn't married to anyone. And then we know that he had black slaves and servants. Next slide. But here's a marriage record for one of their children at Aguas Calientes from the 3rd of September, 1685. The child is Maria. She's listed as Morisca. And the legitimate daughter of Francisco Montes and Maria Jimenez. Maria Jimenez Anciso is consistently listed as Española, Spanish. So we know then that Francisco Montes Vigil must have been mulatto. Next slide. Now look at this, the modern day CASTA system, DNA. Raise your hand if you've done your DNA, had your DNA. Okay, a few of us done. I think it's fascinating, it's interesting, but we have to be careful. We don't start applying it in the same way that our ancestors used the CASTA system. My DNA, my Y DNA, that's my chromosome, my male chromosome, is haplogroup JM7444. That goes back to the Middle East. That means my male ancestor, if you go back 500 years, was Spanish, more than likely. Brought that with him. And my mtDNA mitochondrial is B2 on my mom's mom's mom, going all the way back. And that's probably Puebloan. So this gives us some insight into that part of our ancestry. But look, I show up as 67% European or Spanish, 29% Native American, Middle Eastern, that would probably be Moorish or Muslim, 2%, and Jewish, Sephardic Jewish, 2%. We have to be careful with these percentages. That does not mean 67% of my ancestors are Spanish. That just means that's my DNA mix. The truth is it's closer to 50-50 probably. And if two siblings do this test, they're not going to have the same percentages. Next slide. So with DNA genealogy, we've learned for New Mexicans, this is going back to the Mexican colonial period, the Hispanic people, roughly 80% of male Y DNA chromosome is Spanish. That doesn't mean all the men are Spanish. They're mixed blood too. It just means their chromosome, that one, their atom going back 500 years. And that conversely, 80% of our maternal chromosome is 80% is Native American. So that shows that the mixing has been going on for centuries. Again, my dad's Y DNA is J, but my mom's is B. There's that mestizaje, mixing. Next slide. Castas in New Spain and New Mexico. These documents illustrate the complexities of the Spanish colonial casta or caste system, where individuals and families moved with fluidity from one designation to another. Castas in New Spain became españoles in New Mexico, though sometimes casta designations were carried to the north. In other words, you could still be considered a mestizo in Mexico City and one up here as well. Next slide. I love this quote by Octavio Paz, the Mexican author, writer. He's quite amazing. The strange food, the colors, the landscapes, the women with different skin and eyes, Indian, mestizo, mulatto, the complicity of the sun and the vegetation, the voluptuousness of the climate, all this stirred the imagination, the senses. We've been mixing for centuries. There we go, Casta family, 1970, that's my family. That droopy guy wearing the suit and tie at the bottom, that's me. About 6 years old there, 5 years old, 6-year-old. There's my sister Doris at the bottom, and then I'm between my parents, my father Roberto, Martínez, my mom, Ramona Elena Salazar. She's very light-skinned, green eyes, and she shows 34% Native American. Above her is my sister Maxine, and then with the glasses, Debbie Martínez, La Chicanita, the singer. And at the top, my brother Lorenzo. And you could see the different shades because we're mixed. Some are light-skinned, some in the middle, some a little darker. That's Casta in action. Next slide. State historian, that's me. There's my contact information. And that's it for me. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Any questions or comments? I'm sure there are some. I know you've been waiting.
These priests that were doing the categorization, did anybody ever categorize them? I mean, were they españoles puros?
Here's the thing. The short answer, yes, kind of. To be in the priesthood in Spain, in Mexico, you could be poor, but you did have to have a certain calidad. Typically, you were supposed to be Espanol, Spanish, but Rick Hendricks and I actually a few years ago started looking at some of these priests, and it turns out that some of them were part African. Some of them were part Native American in Mexico. And, you know, they were coming up here. But yes, essentially, the priests were supposed to be Spanish. The governors were Spanish. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a certain amount of egalitarian in this system, especially in New Mexico. But if you notice, none of the viceroys were castas. None of the governors were castas. The Spanish governors sent up here were Spanish, from Spain usually. And they tended, the priests and the governors tended to have a bit of a superiority complex. They were from Mexico City, the vice-regal capital. If you've ever been to Puebla or Guadalajara or Zacatecas, they're beautiful stone buildings. But we learn, like from the 1776 report, that the priests, they would look, they were like, what is this place? There's the buildings are all adobe. They were used to stone fountains and stone cathedrals. And we had our little churches. They're beautiful, but people didn't think they were beautiful until the 1920s. You know, before that, they were very functional in a frontier area that did not have a lot of wealth or wealth at all. So, but yes, some of them, the priests, did have some mixing when we did some of their genealogies, but not a lot of them. Yes.
Was the term peninsulare used to describe people from Spain?
Yeah, that's a good question. Peninsular was a Spaniard from Spain. You don't see it used like in New Mexico too much. You don't see it in the Oñate documents, but a peninsular typically was a Spaniard from Spain. A criollo was a Spaniard born in the Americas, but both parents were from Spain. So it was, you were definitely Spanish, but you were not from Spain. It was believed that the Spaniards from Spain were of a superior quality and that something happened to you, even if you were of Spanish ancestry, some kind of bad happened to your character if you were born outside of Spain. Kind of a strange idea, but that's what was believed. That's why you have Our Lady of Guadalupe becomes a symbol of freedom and liberation, especially in 1821, but even back in the 1500s, for Indios, for mulattoes, for the mixed blood mestizos, but also for criollos, for Spanish born in the Americas, to kind of say, hey, we're important too. But yeah, you see that, but it's not part of the casta system. They were set apart, the peninsulares.
So what was the term used in New Mexico for
Español.
Spanish?
Yeah, so someone like Bartolomé Montoya from Spain or Bartolomé Romero, these were not high-level people. They were settlers, they were soldier colonists. We went in the 1990s and the early 2000s, we went to Mexico City, to Zacatecas to look for these people, for Hernan Martín Serrano. They're just not in the records. They were not high-level people. So your peninsular was a term that was used for archbishops, for viceroys, for members of the audiencia. That was the parliamentary ruling class in Mexico City. Someone like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz probably would be called Española, maybe Criolla, but not a peninsular. She was from Mexico. Yes.
It's kind of complicated question. Maybe not. I'm from northern New Mexico, and I know 7 Peter Martinez's.
Wow.
So people say, oh, you're from Taos. Do you know Peter Martinez? Juaneros. How likely is it that there was more than one Francisco Vigil running around?
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know. I don't know how likely it is. I mean, we do know we have the muster rolls. Juan Paez Hurtado, that was Vargas's second in command. He went in 1695 to Zacatecas to recruit colonists to come to New Mexico. And there's a whole case. Jack Colligan wrote a book about it. There's documents. The documents are there. He was busted for embezzlement, Paez Hurtado, and he was caught sneaking in. He's supposed to get Espanol families. He was tricking the documents, writing that they were Espanol, but they were actually mulattos, mestizos. But in those documents, Francisco Montes Vigil and Bartolomé Lovato, they show up as helping him in this scam. So that's where we know he comes from those documents. And then we have those early cattle distribution documents from the 1690s when they first come up here. They're promised cattle, they're promised land. So it's not hard to trace him or see what's happening there. We know who he is. He came with Paez Hurtado. He's in the documents, and there's no mention of other Francisco Montes Vigils. There may have been. I mean, we may never know. Just like the pre-revolt people, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 destroyed all the church and civil documents. So it's almost impossible to trace back to those Oñate colonists. So we try to piece it together with names. Hernan Martín, Pedro Durán Chavez, but we don't know. We don't know who was running around New Mexico in the 1600s.
I just asked,
Yeah.
so many people were being born.
You just don't know.
Because,
But we do know that the Lovato family is established by Bartolomé Lovato. But we also find other Lovatos showing up. Matias Lovato shows up. Is he a brother? Is he an uncle? Is he a cousin? We don't know. We don't have enough documents to show who he is. There might have been another Francisco Montes Vigil. There may have been, but we know, I think there was a son named after him. So, yeah.
Thank you.
You got it. Yes.
When did Spain become so fixated with, a person's origin and their makeup?
I don't know. I mean, I think race has always played a part in history. I mean, but like slavery, for example, the Romans didn't enslave people based on their race or skin color. They enslaved them based on if they conquered them. If they conquered people who looked just like them, it didn't matter. They just conquered them. It's really, I would say in the 1400s, when Portugal and Spain start enslaving Black Africans, that's where you start getting that. So that's part of it for Spain. But there's also this idea in the Middle Ages of convivencia, this romantic notion of coexistence of Catholics, Jews, and Muslims living together. And they did coexist peacefully, but there were also wars and violence. But you also, that's where you start getting this idea of mixing. But it's really 1492 with the Alhambra decree, the expulsion of the Jews, where it starts to really take hold. This idea of we need to be one kind of people. We need to have one religion. And obviously, I mean, if you had a Jewish grandparent, you couldn't hold certain jobs in the government. So that also starts, I would say, in the mid to late 1400s. And it just goes from there. Anything else? Well, muchas gracias. Thank you for having me.